Hey, amazing viewers! Before we go into this riveting narrative, drop your location in the comments below. We love connecting with you all around the world. Also, if this is your first time here, press the subscribe button and join our incredible journey. Let's hit 10,000 subscribers this month together. Your support means everything. The unspoken rules of the road. The city was quiet at this hour, the usual chaos of the day reduced to a series of flickering streetlights and the occasional hum of an engine. Maya Caldwell loosened her grip on the steering wheel as she eased her car down the near-empty avenue, the soft purr of her Mercedes barely registering against the gentle hum of jazz playing through her speakers. It was late, too late, but that was nothing new. The life of a federal prosecutor didn't come with predictable hours, and tonight had been no exception. The Thompson case had consumed every second of her attention for the past week, a grueling federal trial that had her cross-referencing witness statements long past dinner. Now, with exhaustion pulling at her shoulders, she was finally heading home, longing for a hot shower and the comforting solitude of her apartment. The roads were nearly deserted, save for the occasional pedestrian cutting through alleyways. The cool September air drifted through her cracked window, carrying the faint scent of damp pavement and city life. As she reached a red light, she took a deep breath, rolling her neck to relieve the ache from hours of tension. Then she noticed them. A police cruiser idling at the corner, headlights dim, engine running. Two officers inside, watching. Maya sighed internally. She'd been here before. The unspoken rules of being a black woman behind the wheel of a luxury car in the wrong part of town were ingrained in her since she was old enough to drive. She could feel their gaze through the tinted glass, their silent scrutiny as they sized her up, ran through their mental checklist of what kind of threat she might pose. She adjusted her posture, keeping her hands at 10 and 2, obeying the speed limit with precision. Even though she had done nothing wrong, she braced herself for the inevitable. Sure enough, as soon as she made her turn, the blue and red lights erupted behind her. Her stomach tightened, but her face remained calm. This was not her first time being pulled over for nothing. With practiced efficiency, she signaled and pulled over to the curb, shifting into park. The police car rolled up behind her, its high beams flooding her interior. Maya inhaled deeply before reaching into her glove compartment for her registration, moving slowly, deliberately. Every movement was calculated, ensuring that when they approached, her hands were already in clear sight. She knew how easily hesitation or the wrong motion could escalate things. The first officer, tall, stocky, and exuding quiet arrogance, stepped up to her window. His flashlight flickered over her face, settling there too long, the glare making her squint. His partner, younger but just as watchful, hovered behind him, a hand resting casually on his holster. License and registration. The officer's voice was clipped, businesslike. Maya didn't move immediately. Instead, she turned her head slightly, meeting his gaze with the kind of steady calm she used in the courtroom. "May I ask why I'm being stopped, officer?" Her voice was controlled, even. Not confrontational, just enough professionalism to remind them she wasn't intimidated. The officer smirked, like he was amused by the question. "You rolled through a stop sign back there." Lies. Maya hadn't rolled through anything. She had stopped. She had been watching. But arguing was pointless. She had seen this play out too many times, both in real life and in the countless cases she prosecuted against officers like these. Instead, she nodded slightly and handed over her documents. The officer took them, retreating to his cruiser without another word. His partner remained, standing just close enough to loom, but not enough to be outright threatening. A stall tactic. Maya had been through this before. They were running her plates, checking for anything, an unpaid ticket, a clerical mistake, some excuse to drag this out. When they found nothing, they'd move to the next step, trying to find a reason to escalate. Sure enough, a few minutes later, the officer returned. "Step out of the vehicle, Mom." Maya's jaw tightened. There was no reason for this. She could feel it. The shift. The moment when a routine stop turns into something else. "I don't consent to a search of my vehicle," she said firmly, though she reached for her seatbelt. The smirk was back. "I smelled marijuana in the car." There it was, the magic phrase. The words that turned an unjustified stop into probable cause. Maya's pulse pounded, but her face remained neutral. This was textbook. She had argued cases about stops like this, reviewed dozens of bodycam footages where officers used this exact line. The officer's grip on his belt tightened. "Step out of the car." Maya didn't hesitate this time. She moved slowly, deliberately, her heart pounding with controlled anger. Not fear. She was done being afraid. As she stepped onto the pavement, she could feel the power shift around her. The officer was waiting for resistance, for some reason to make this more than it was. But Maya knew the game. She straightened her shoulders, lifted her chin, and spoke clearly. "I am a federal prosecutor for the United States government, and I am recording this interaction." The air changed. For a brief moment, there was a pause, the kind of hesitation that only came when someone realized they had made a mistake. But then, the smirk returned, thinner this time. "That's so." He didn't believe her. But that was fine. Because by tomorrow, he would wish he had. The weight of power. Maya stood still, the night air pressing against her skin, but the tension around her was heavier than anything she'd ever felt in a courtroom. The officer's flashlight remained fixed on her face, but she refused to look away. She had spent years mastering the art of stillness, the ability to hold her ground in the presence of men who wielded authority as a weapon. She had faced judges, defense attorneys, and criminals alike. None of them had ever made her flinch, and she wasn't about to start now. "You're a federal prosecutor," Officer Langley repeated, his voice dripping with doubt. His grip on his belt remained firm, his hand hovering near his holster. A warning. A dare. His partner, Grayson, chuckled softly, shaking his head as he exchanged a look with Langley. It was the kind of look that spoke of confidence, of certainty, as if they had already decided this would end on their terms, not hers. "That's real cute," Langley finally said. "You think throwing around a fancy job title changes anything out here?" Maya's expression didn't shift. "No, officer. I think the law does." That wiped the smirk off Langley's face. For the first time, he hesitated, not because he was afraid, but because the playbook he had been following his entire career had suddenly encountered an unexpected page. A different tactic, then. "Ma'am, we have reason to believe there's illegal substances in your vehicle." His voice was smooth, controlled. "If you refuse a search, we'll have to call for a K-9 unit." Textbook. Maya had prosecuted officers for this exact routine. The smell of marijuana claim. The K-9 threat. The escalating tone designed to put pressure on civilians who didn't understand their rights. But Maya did understand her rights, and she was done playing along. "Call your sergeant instead," she said, voice steady. "Now." Grayson scoffed. "That's not how this works." Maya finally moved, tilting her head slightly. "Actually, that's exactly how it works. Unless you're admitting that you don't have probable cause and you're making an illegal stop." The flicker of uncertainty was brief, but Maya caught it. She knew the system better than they ever could. And that's what scared them. She could see it now. The moment where realization curled around their thoughts. They had expected fear, compliance, or anger. Not this. Not someone who knew the game better than they did. But power, real power, was a funny thing. It didn't matter if she was a prosecutor. It didn't matter if she knew every law they were violating. It didn't matter that her entire career was built on the foundation of truth and justice. Because in this moment, in this cold and empty street, the only power that mattered was the one strapped to their belts. Langley's smirk returned, and it was different this time. Meaner, sharper. "You want to play hardball, lady? Fine." Before she could react, his hands were on her. He yanked her wrist behind her back, twisting it at an unnatural angle, making pain explode through her shoulder. The shock of it made her stumble, her heel scraping against the curb as he forced her body against the side of her own car. A dull thud, a sharp sting. Her breath left her in a short, startled gasp as her cheek pressed against the cold metal of her vehicle. This was it. This was how they won. Not with words, not with logic, but with brute force. Grayson moved in, grabbing her other arm and locking cold steel around her wrists. The handcuffs dug into her skin, biting at her bones. Her head spun with rage, but she forced herself to stay silent, because that's what they were waiting for. They wanted her to fight, to struggle, to give them an excuse. She refused, but her silence didn't protect her. "Stop resisting," Langley suddenly barked, loud enough to carry through the street. Maya's stomach dropped. The words were a script, a line she had read in too many case files, spoken by too many officers who had lied their way into justifying violence. But she wasn't resisting. She was standing still. Yet it didn't matter. Grayson shoved her forward again, her body jolting against the car. The sound of it, metal against flesh, was sharp enough that she saw movement in the corner of her eye. A bystander. A young man in a hoodie, standing on the opposite sidewalk. His phone raised. Recording. Grayson noticed him immediately, his head snapping up. "Move along," he ordered, his voice dropping into a dangerous growl. "This is police business." The young man hesitated, and for a moment, just a moment, Maya thought he might stay. But Grayson took one step forward, his hand shifting to his holster. A silent warning. The young man's grip on his phone faltered. His feet shuffled backward. And then, just like that, he was gone. Maya's last witness had disappeared into the dark. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but she refused to let them see her break. They thought they had won. That's what men like them always thought. They always believed they were invincible. But they had made a mistake. A small one. A detail they hadn't noticed. Maya's phone was still recording. The entire interaction, the false accusation, the excessive force, the violation of her rights, was already backed up to her cloud. And when morning came, the weight of their power would be nothing compared to the weight of the law. Because she was not just another black woman in the wrong neighborhood. She was the system they thought they controlled. And they had just picked the wrong prosecutor to mess with. The system wasn't built for people like her. The inside of the precinct smelled like disinfectant and cold metal. The air was sterile, artificial, the kind of place where time didn't just slow down, it suffocated. Maya's heels clicked against the concrete floor as she was marched down the dimly lit corridor, her wrists aching from the handcuffs that were far too tight. She had handled evidence in cases where officers left bruises on suspects simply because they could, and now she could feel those same marks forming on her own skin. Langley and Grayson hadn't said much after stuffing her into the back of their patrol car, but their silence was filled with unspoken arrogance. This was routine to them. Just another night, just another person who didn't matter. Except they had no idea who they had just thrown into their system. Maya had spent years inside courtrooms, watching police officers give scripted testimonies, jurors nodding along as if their words were gospel. She had read hundreds of case files detailing wrongful arrests, excessive force, and the quiet manipulations of a system designed to protect those who abused it. And now she was living it. She had seen black men and women sitting in these same holding cells, wearing the same expression of forced composure, knowing that any sign of frustration could be twisted into aggression. She had represented clients whose entire lives were upended because an officer thought they looked suspicious. And yet, despite all of that knowledge, despite knowing exactly how this worked, the weight of the moment still pressed down on her. Because even though she had power inside a courtroom, she had none inside this building. Here, she wasn't a federal prosecutor. She was just another black woman they had decided was a problem. A sharp voice pulled her from her thoughts. Name. The booking surgeon barely glanced at her as he typed on his keyboard, the glow of the screen casting shadows across his weathered face. Maya lifted her chin. Maya Caldwell. The surgeon's fingers hesitated for a fraction of a second before continuing to type. He knew the name. He had heard it before. Good. Langley leaned against the counter, arms crossed, a smug look on his face. Let's get this over with, he muttered. Maya watched as the system processed her like she was nothing more than a file in a database. Fingerprints. Mugshot. Personal belongings placed into a plastic bin. Each step stripped away a layer of her identity, reducing her to a number in their system. She could feel Grayson watching her, waiting for the moment she would crack, waiting for the reality of the situation to sink in. But Maya didn't break. Instead, she did something that threw them off just enough to rattle them. She smiled. Not because she was amused. Not because this was funny. But because she knew something they didn't. She knew that by tomorrow morning, the story of her arrest would be everywhere. And there wouldn't be a damn thing they could do to stop it. The holding cell. The cell was cold. The metal bench against the back wall felt like ice as Maya sat down, carefully crossing her legs. There were already 2 women inside, one older, dressed in scrubs, and another younger, wearing a tattered hoodie and ripped jeans. They both glanced up as she entered. The woman in scrubs gave a knowing sigh. What'd they get you for? Maya leaned back against the wall, the coolness seeping through her thin blouse. Driving while black, she said dryly. The woman in scrubs snorted. Yeah, that one's real popular. The younger woman didn't laugh. She was watching Maya carefully, her dark eyes flickering with curiosity and recognition. You're not like the usual people they throw in here. Maya tilted her head slightly. And what kind of people do they usually throw in here? The girl shrugged. People like me. There was no bitterness in her voice, just acceptance, the kind that came from understanding, from experience. Maya studied her for a moment. What's your name? Tasha. The woman in scrubs chimed in, Sandra. Maya nodded at them both. Sandra gestured to the doorway. They've been telling us for hours that the phones are down for maintenance. She shook her head. You and I both know that's a lie. Maya sighed. Yeah, I do. She knew exactly what they were doing. Delaying phone calls, keeping detainees cut off from their lawyers, their families, making people feel isolated enough to accept whatever charges were thrown at them. Sandra studied her again, this time with more curiosity. You a lawyer? Maya hesitated. She hadn't planned to reveal anything yet, but something in Sandra's expression made her reconsider. So she nodded. Yeah, federal prosecutor. The reaction was instant. Tasha's eyes widened. Sandra let out a low whistle. Damn, Tasha muttered. They'd really messed up, huh? Maya smiled faintly. Yeah, they really did. But before anyone could say anything else, the cell door opened with a loud clang. Caldwell. A young officer stood at the entrance, clearly uncomfortable. He avoided her gaze, shifting on his feet. Your lawyer's here. Maya rose to her feet smoothly. She followed the officer out, feeling the weight of Tasha and Sandra's eyes on her back as she walked away. She didn't turn around, but she made a silent promise to herself. When this was over, when she was standing in front of the cameras exposing this corruption for what it was, she wasn't just going to clear her name. She was going to make sure women like them never had to go through this again. The consultation room. David Harrison was waiting. Maya had known him for years, had fought cases beside him, had gone toe-to-toe with him in legal debates that lasted well into the night. But tonight, there was no debate. Tonight, they were on the same side. His dark eyes scanned her quickly, his sharp gaze noting every detail. The red marks on her wrists, the slight bruise on her cheek where she had been pressed against her car, the way her blouse was slightly rumpled from being handled like a criminal. His jaw tightened. Tell me everything. Maya didn't hesitate. She laid out the events of the night with surgical precision, her prosecutor's mind organizing each detail into a case that would soon dismantle everything Langley and Grayson thought they had built. David's pen moved furiously across his legal pad, his expression darkening as she spoke. When she finally finished, he exhaled slowly. "Maya, we need to tell them who you are." Maya's lips curved into a dangerous smile. "Not yet." David frowned. "Why the hell not?" Maya leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Because I want to see how far they'll go." David stared at her for a long moment, then sighed. "You always did have a thing for setting traps." Maya shrugged. "Well, they walked right into this one." A knock on the door interrupted them. Officer Langley poked his head inside, smirking. "Time's up. Night court's waiting." Maya met his eyes and smiled. Oh, they had no idea what was coming. The moment they realized they had lost. The courtroom was nearly empty at this hour, but the weight of its history clung to the walls like an unshakable presence. Dim fluorescent lights buzzed softly above, casting shadows over the rows of empty benches. At the front of the room, the judge's bench loomed high, an unspoken reminder that in this space, power was absolute. Maya Caldwell had spent years standing in courtrooms just like this one, arguing cases, dismantling defenses, and making men like Langley and Grayson answer for their abuses. But tonight, she wasn't standing behind a prosecutor's table. Tonight, she was standing in the defendant's seat. And tonight, she wasn't fighting for someone else's rights. She was fighting for her own. The smirk that wouldn't last. Judge Wesson sat behind the bench, reading through the case file with a practiced detachment. His glasses rested at the tip of his nose, and he barely acknowledged Maya as she was led inside. Elliot Bradshaw, the prosecutor assigned to her case, stood at his table with a self-satisfied smirk, his tailored suit unwrinkled, his tie still perfectly in place, like he had just come from an expensive dinner rather than walking into a courtroom at nearly 2 in the morning. He didn't glance at her. He didn't have to. To him, she was already guilty. Her lawyer, David Harrison, was standing to the side, his hands carefully folded in front of him. A calculated move, one Maya recognized. It meant he was holding back anger, waiting for the exact moment to strike. Langley and Grayson stood casually near the prosecutor's table, whispering to each other like this was all a joke, like they had already won. Maya let them believe that. For now. The first lie. Judge Wesson cleared his throat and finally spoke, his voice carrying the weight of indifference. "We are here to set bail." He glanced at Bradshaw. "Mr. Bradshaw, proceed." Bradshaw straightened his tie before stepping forward. His voice was calm, smooth, calculated, just like Maya expected. "Your Honor, the defendant was combative during her arrest. She failed to comply with officers, resisted detention, and was found in possession of illegal substances. We believe she is a flight risk." Maya's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. David, however, let out a low chuckle, the kind that wasn't meant to be funny. Judge Wesson glanced at him. "Something amusing, Mr. Harrison?" David nodded. "Yes, actually. I find it amusing that Mr. Bradshaw can say all of that with a straight face." Bradshaw's eyes narrowed slightly. "Excuse me." David took his time stepping forward. When he spoke, his tone was measured, deliberate, each word hitting like a hammer against stone. "My client is a federal prosecutor, Your Honor." The entire room shifted. Judge Wesson froze mid-page turn. Bradshaw's smirk faltered. Langley and Grayson. Their confidence vanished. This was the moment they realized they had lost. The sound of fear. The silence stretched for 1, 2, 3 beats too long before Judge Wesson recovered, adjusting his glasses and clearing his throat. "Is that true?" he asked, looking directly at Maya. She lifted her chin. "Yes, Your Honor." Another pause. Then the first crack in the facade. Bradshaw hesitated, just slightly, before shaking his head. "That changes nothing." David laughed under his breath. Oh, Bradshaw, it changes everything. He turned sharply, facing the officers. Let's go over this again, shall we? His voice was sharper now, each word cutting like a knife. You pulled over a federal prosecutor, one of your own legal representatives, on a fabricated charge. You escalated the situation without cause. You used force to detain her. You denied her a phone call. You falsified a report to claim she resisted. And then, to top it all off, you lied under oath to the court. Langley shifted uncomfortably, his cocky stance now rigid with tension. Grayson's fingers curled into a tight fist at his side. Maya watched it all, memorizing every flicker of their fear. Because now, they knew exactly who she was, and exactly what she could do to them. The desperate scramble. Bradshaw wasn't an idiot. He knew damage control was necessary, and he was already trying to figure out how to minimize the fallout. Your Honor, he began, if this is a misunderstanding. David cut him off. A misunderstanding? He scoffed. No, Bradshaw. A misunderstanding is when someone gives the wrong coffee order. This was an abuse of power. This was targeted harassment. This was false imprisonment. Judge Wesson exhaled heavily, rubbing his temple. Maya watched him carefully. She knew his history, knew he was sympathetic to law enforcement, but even he wasn't going to risk his career by protecting officers who had just arrested a federal attorney on made-up charges. He turned toward Bradshaw. Do you have any legitimate reason to move forward with this case? Bradshaw's jaw clenched. Your Honor. Yes or no. The words hung in the air. Then, finally, Bradshaw exhaled. No, Your Honor. Langley and Grayson stiffened. Judge Wesson nodded. Then I see no reason to detain Ms. Caldwell further. And just like that, it was over. Walking free. Maya felt the handcuffs being removed, the cold steel slipping away from her skin. She didn't rub her wrists. She didn't acknowledge the red marks left behind. Instead, she turned to Langley and Grayson. Their faces were blank, but their eyes were filled with panic. Maya leaned in just slightly, lowering her voice so only they could hear. You should have done your homework. Then, without waiting for a response, she turned and walked out. David followed beside her, his expression unreadable, but Maya knew him too well. The second they stepped outside the courtroom doors, he exhaled. Maya, I swear to God, you are going to give me a heart attack one day. She grinned. But it was worth it, wasn't it? David gave her a long look, then finally chuckled. Oh yeah, worth every damn second. Maya glanced up at the dark sky above. The night was almost over. But this was just the beginning. Because now, Langley and Grayson weren't just two corrupt cops abusing their power. Now, they were about to become the next big headline. And she would make sure of it. The reckoning. The air outside the courthouse was crisp with the scent of a city that never truly slept. The sky was a deep shade of navy, the stars muted by the ever-present glow of streetlights. But for the first time all night, Maya Caldwell felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel since the moment she saw those flashing red and blue lights behind her. Relief. She was free. Not because the system had worked in her favor, but because she knew how to make the system work for her. And now, it was time to return the favor. The warpath begins. David had parked his car at the curb, but neither of them made a move to get in just yet. They stood there for a moment, both of them quiet, both of them waiting for the weight of the night to settle. David was the first to speak. So, what's the plan? Maya exhaled, rolling her shoulders as if shaking off the remnants of the injustice she had just endured. We take everything they did tonight, every single violation, and we make sure they don't just lose their badges. She turned her head, meeting his gaze. We make sure they can never do this to anyone else again. David smirked. I was hoping you'd say that. He pulled out his phone, already typing something into his notes. First things first. Internal affairs. Maya shook her head. No. IA will stall it, bury it, and by the time they even open an investigation, Langley and Grayson will be walking around like nothing ever happened. David's smirk widened. So we go public. Maya nodded. Because if there was one thing the system hated more than bad publicity, it was being forced to answer for it. The broadcast that shook the system. By 9 a.m., the city was awake. The streets were filled with people heading to work, sipping their overpriced coffees, preparing for another day in their neatly structured lives. And then, Maya's face appeared on every screen in the city. The news anchor's voice was clear and sharp, delivering each word like a dagger into the heart of the police department. Breaking news. A federal prosecutor was wrongfully arrested last night in what appears to be a clear case of racial profiling and abuse of power by 2 veteran police officers. The footage played on repeat. The grainy cell phone recording from the bystander. The bodycam footage David had subpoenaed overnight. The same footage that showed Langley's smug smirk as he falsely accused her of resisting arrest. And then the recorded audio from her phone. The nation listened as Langley's voice, calm, cocky, assured of his authority, spoke into existence the lie that would ruin him. I smell marijuana in the car. And then Maya's voice, clear, steady, unwavering. That's impossible, officer. I don't use drugs. The silence that followed was deafening. By noon, social media was on fire. By 2 p.m., the mayor had issued a statement condemning systematic misconduct and promising an independent investigation. By 4 p.m., Langley and Grayson had been placed on immediate suspension. By 6 p.m., every major news outlet was outside the police precinct, waiting for a comment. And by 9 p.m., Maya Caldwell was seated across from a primetime news anchor, telling her story in her own words. The unraveling. She didn't hold back. She laid out the details, step by step, move by move, each violation, each abuse of power, each calculated act designed to strip her of her dignity. And she didn't just talk about herself. She talked about Sandra, who had been arrested for a stop sign that didn't exist. She talked about Tasha, who had been thrown in a cell for simply existing in a neighborhood officers had deemed wrong. She made sure their names were heard, because that was the real goal. Langley and Grayson weren't the disease. They were a symptom of something deeper, something rotting. And Maya wasn't just going after 2 bad cops. She was going after the system that allowed them to exist. The house of cards collapses. The investigation moved faster than anyone had anticipated. It turned out, Langley and Grayson weren't just corrupt. They were sloppy. Old cases resurfaced. Patterns of false reports, excessive force, and racial profiling emerged. Complaints that had been quietly buried found their way into headlines. And soon, it wasn't just Langley and Grayson under fire. It was their entire precinct. It was their entire department. One arrest turned into an avalanche. And Maya, she was at the center of it all. The verdict. 3 months later, Langley and Grayson sat in the same courtroom where they had once watched Maya stand in handcuffs. Only this time, they were the ones in orange jumpsuits. The irony was almost poetic. Maya watched from the prosecution's table, her expression unreadable as the judge read the charges against them. And when their guilty verdicts were announced, she didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She just exhaled. Because this wasn't about revenge. It was about justice. The last message. That night, Maya sat in her office, the city skyline glowing behind her. The emails were flooding in. Messages of support, calls for her to run for office, offers from organizations that wanted her to lead reform movements. But she ignored all of them. Instead, she opened a single message. From an unknown number. A single sentence. Thank you for not forgetting about us. No name. No signature. But Maya didn't need one. She already knew who it was from. Sandra. Or Tasha. Or maybe one of the countless others who had been lost in the system. She stared at the message for a long time. Then, finally, she typed back. I never will. This concludes the story. Thank you for watching until the end. I hope you found it enjoyable. If you did, please consider liking the video and sharing it with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and activate the notification bell for more captivating stories. Have a great day.